Okay, awesome. Right, welcome everybody. Really looking forward to this evening where Romy is going to be discussing her experience of living with Tourette syndrome. Really important that I do just reiterate this is Romy's experience and it's different for everybody. If you want to ask questions throughout, please use the chat box. Don't unmute yourself. But at the end, we will have an opportunity for question and answers where you can either use the chat box or you can turn your mic on and we can have a nice little chat. Like I say, this is recorded, so it will be shared afterwards. By remaining in the webinar, that's you giving permission for us to share that at the end. For those of you who know me, hello, nice to see you again. For those of you who don't, I am Sarah and I am the CEO of TikTok Therapy, where I deliver behavioural interventions for children with tics, and also I run workshops like this one, and also group workshops for children to help them, meet others and learn about their condition. Okay, Romy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much for having me on here. I'm Romy, I am 17 years old and I have Tourette syndrome and some co-occurring conditions, and I'm really grateful to be able to share my experiences here.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, we're going to get straight to it. Now, first off, I'd love it if you could tell us how old you were when your tics started.
Well, I did have some very subtle signs when I was around 4 to 6 years old. I think I had like muscle tensing and I would spit food out, but it was never anything major. But then at the age of 8, it did all explode overnight, and then I developed some very severe tics then. So it really fully started around 8.
Okay, fantastic. And at what age were you diagnosed?
I was formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at the age of 15, and that's a long time from where it started, but that was because at the time the doctors didn't really understand it, and for many years it was put down to bad parenting, learned behaviour, lack of discipline, autism, and we weren't really listened to, and I wasn't referred to a neurologist because they didn't really see the point. But then thankfully at 14, I went to a Tourette's event and they were talking about benefits of actually having a formal diagnosis on paper, because I knew I had it by that point, but I still hadn't got it like on paper. So I managed to get referred to a neurologist by my GP, and within about 20 seconds of being there, they saw me tic. I walked in pretty much, I was yelling stuff and pretty much cleared the desk, and they're like, "You definitely have Tourette's." So thankfully, just by finding a doctor who understood, they're like, "Yeah."
Yes, so important to be able to find someone who understands the condition and actually knows something about it. I think the worst I hear constantly is where families have taken their child to the doctors and the doctor said, "Oh, it's a habit," they grow out of it and dismiss their concerns.
Yeah.
So it's so could you tell me like how your tics started out and with comparison to how they are now?
Yeah. So when they first started, it was, the biggest thing was Tourette OCD, and that was tic-like in the sense that my rituals were preceded by sensations, so that was a big thing. But I did have some more classic tics then, but the classic tics did seem to build up more over time. So I had a lot of muscle tensing my stomach. I would clap my hands, I would scratch my arms, I would just bend over to touch the floor. That was all when I was younger. And when I was younger, I didn't really have the yelling phrases, but I had barking like a dog, yelping, just random sounds and stuff. And then in my teenage years, it kind of developed into yelling full-on phrases and like falling to the floor and full body tics and throwing things and stuff like that. So thankfully now it's better than it was when I was younger. For me personally, I found that diet did help me, and for about a year or so, my tics were actually virtually non-existent. So that was really amazing. They're a bit more elevated now since I had an infection, but they are so much better now, thankfully, than they used to be. So that's good.
Brilliant. And at what age were your tics at their worst?
Well, I'd say all of the symptoms were the worst when I was younger, because that's when it was most disabling. So I would say that, but some of the more complex tics, like the vocal ones, that was around the ages of 14 and 15. My vocal tics, there were full phrases and stuff, so that's when that really exploded, I would say.
Okay, brilliant. Now, could you tell us, obviously you've just said where your tics started at 8, so that's smack in the middle of primary school, and they were worst at, older teens whilst you were at secondary school. Could you tell us about your experience of being at primary school and then at secondary school of, living with tics?
Yeah, like, interestingly, at primary school, my symptoms were very severe in the home environment, but I didn't show any signs in school. So we think I was sort of subconsciously suppressing because I was like really anxious about it and didn't let anything out, which meant that at home it kind of came out. But then it's because I was like really ashamed of it. I didn't actually let my parents tell the school much about it. They only knew the basics, like I was diagnosed with OCD, that's all they were really aware of. So in primary school, I think it was just towards the end of year 6, pretty much just before I was about to leave, that we had a meeting to talk about the tics and stuff, and then I started ticking more in class. But I think that's because there was another student with Tourettes in the class, and I couldn't hide it any longer because we were kind of ping-ponging off each other. And then when I was in secondary school, thankfully they were really accepting, and I am very grateful for that, and I'm very lucky with that because I know some people who the school isn't understanding and stuff. So I'm lucky that they were able to give me the support I needed. So that in year 7, I had like a sort of mentor teacher who I went to speak to if I was anxious, and they were really lovely. And I also had a pupil support centre card, which is where I just give it to a teacher and be able to go out of class into that space to do my work there if I couldn't cope in the classroom. And they also allowed me to keep my uniform on for PE lessons because I couldn't really dress myself because my rituals were really complex. So they were really understanding of that and made a lot of allowances for me, which was really good. And then thankfully, like, they did offer more support, as it seemed to, like, 14, 15, as I said, my tics are very complex. So at that point, at 14 and 15, they gave me half days on some days because I couldn't really function for the full day because my tics would just exacerbate so much in the school environment because of all the sensory input and stuff. So they allowed me to have that, and then also the exam accommodations, thankfully, extra time and a separate room. And also I had a laptop, which was really nice as well because my tics, I would throw pens across the classroom and there'd be pens flying. So I just had a laptop instead. It was much easier without the stuff flying across the classroom. So I am very lucky that my school were able to provide me with that support and stuff. And some lessons, like where my tics were worse, maths lessons were a massive issue. They always have been. But in maths, they allowed me to do my work in the pupil support centre instead of going to maths lessons, and then they gave me a maths tutor to sort of catch up and stuff. And I think they also allowed me to chew gum for a while because when I chewed gum, it sort of redirected some of the tics, so I didn't yell so much.
That's brilliant. And can you tell me, like, the transition from primary to secondary school? Did you go with, friends that you knew? Was it a completely new start? I know there's quite a few people, some are watching today and some I know really want to watch the recording, who have got children who are doing that transition up now to the next school and actually haven't got any friends going with them. Some have, obviously, but yeah, just some guidance on how you dealt with explaining it to new friends and how they were towards you. That'd be really good to know.
Yeah, so thankfully I did have a few friends who went with me, but I think what's really important is having clear communication with the school. So I know when I first started, well, before I started secondary school, of course, you go in and stuff, and I was quite lucky to go in as part of a special educational needs thing where students who need extra support went in first to sort of get to know the place. So I just think the important thing is keep in communication with the school. And when I first started, I remember I went to the student support area and I actually said that I think I'll need support and stuff. So I think also allowing the child or student to develop confidence so that they can be their own advocate and ask for support if and when they need it. I think that's really good. And I'm just lucky that I was able to communicate and stuff as well. And it can be quite difficult making friends like with people you don't know. But I did find that over time, people actually got used to my tics and stuff. I think at first the other students were a bit confused, but over time it didn't bother anybody anymore, which was really, really good. And like I am really lucky as well because around year 10, like I think they were thinking about sending me to a medical people referral unit, but I was really lucky to be able to stay with my friends and stuff. And being in communication with the school and making sure they understand is really, really important as well, because when the teachers understand, they set the example for how the other students react. Because if the teachers aren't reacting in a positive way, then the students don't really either. So I think it's really important to have the teachers understand, and it does make the world of difference when you have teachers who understand, because I know like a couple of teachers who made a massive difference to my life. Like my drama teacher like included me in the school production and helped me out and stuff. She found that when I sing, I don't tick and stuff. So, you know, having a teacher who you can relate to and actually find strategies to help you, that is really, really important.
That's fantastic. Thank you. It's really lovely to hear that your transition and your secondary years were so positive. Could you talk a little bit about rage attacks? I know from seeing your YouTube videos that it's something you've experienced. So it'd be really good if you could share that with us.
Yes, I did have a lot of rage attacks between 8 and 12 years old, and they were quite violent. I would hit, kick, scream, shout, and swear. There was one time where I smashed my entire room up and ended up writing on the wall. And they were just very abrupt, and it was at the slightest thing. It kind of intertwined with my OCD as well a bit, because if something was moved, I would suddenly explode because it would sort of cause so much distress. And we found that a massive trigger for me was actually a food dye sensitivity, like the consumption of food dyes. Because I was so sensitive to it, it would just, a few hours later, boom, a whole rage attack would start. And my parents actually said that that was probably one of the hardest things to deal with, because it was almost like walking on eggshells. You didn't know when it was going to explode or what was going to happen, and it was like I was a completely different person, sort of like Jekyll and Hyde, because I'm not usually like that. So for the family, that's very, very difficult. And seeing your child like that as well, it's stressful. So they also didn't know how to manage it, and it was always like we had a behavior chart to try and sort of eliminate it and stuff, but unfortunately it didn't really work because I didn't really have control over it. So it was just very sudden. So we were kind of so confused, like, how do we manage this? And we realized that it wasn't like behavioral, it was neurological, because afterwards I would kind of zone out as I was coming back into it, and then I would kind of be quite remorseful because it was like I was a different person completely.
Wow, that's so interesting, because literally you've just told my story with my son a few years back. It was exactly the same. I used to have anxiety through the roof when we went places because I never knew if it was going to happen. Used to smash the house up, and afterwards would, you know, like you say, come back into the room, and he'd be very remorseful, not really knowing, you know, what he did, why he did it. So it's really interesting to hear you have the same story. Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your coprolalia story? I know you mentioned earlier that you've had some swearing tics in the past. Are they still there? How's that manifesting in you?
Well, my coprolalia, we think it started at a relatively young age, because when I was younger, I would have a tic where I would spell out the F word, but incorrectly, because I couldn't spell it back then. But I had that tic at quite a young age. And then, like, with my old Tourette rituals, like I would sometimes swear in the middle of it, which we now know was a tic. But then it wasn't until around 13 I developed yelling phrases, but thankfully that didn't happen in school. But it's when I was 14 and all of that started happening in school and everything that it became more of a concern. But thankfully the school were again understanding of that. I think it did get a little bit of getting used to for some teachers, but thankfully they were accepting of it. And I ended up sort of writing this mini letter. So if there was a teacher who didn't understand or something, I'd give them a letter. It basically said, I have Tourette's, this is what it does, this is how I'd like to be treated, and like how I would like people to react and stuff. So I gave that out to anybody who needed to see it. And my coprolalia, a lot of it was observational, so it would comment on the surroundings and stuff. But I do think it's really important for people to know that just because it comments on the surroundings, we don't mean it, because it doesn't have any intention behind it. Although it may look it, it really doesn't. It's just sort of like, I describe it as there's like a 3-year-old in my brain trying to mortify me in any way it can, and I would just yell the worst things, obviously without wanting to. And I think with coprolalia, a lot of people have said like they wish they have Tourette's because they get to swear, but it's really not as funny as it's portrayed and stuff, because when you try and like go out in public, you don't want to yell at somebody because you worry about their reaction. Thankfully now, again, I'm able to explain it and stuff, and now my mindset is kind of, if somebody reacts negatively after I've explained, it just reflects their own misunderstanding, and I kind of had to grow in confidence and say, well, I can't control this, it's just something that I accept within myself. And interestingly, like going out with coprolalia helped with my confidence, because I kind of didn't have a choice but to bring attention to myself, so in a way it kind of helped with my confidence. But yes, it was very inappropriate, and that was something that was, I think, hard to deal with for a while. But when you realize it actually has no meaning, it can be ignored. So yeah,
I think again it's really interesting what you said. I'm just going to touch on my son again, because he's just turned 13, only just started with coprolalia in the last probably not even a month. But if we roll back, 3-4 years, I remember him saying to me, why don't I have the swearing version of Tourette's? That would be so cool, because I'm quite strict at home that children aren't allowed to swear. And now he has it. He's like, God, why did I want this? And he's mortified by it, and he's still in the process of adjusting to it. And he moves up to another school this September. So it's been a massive learning curve for him right now. So I definitely can relate to that. Okay, so this has got to be a good one. What has your most awkward Tourette's moment been? What has it done to embarrass you or cause havoc somewhere?
There's quite a few. I think the first that comes to mind is when I was in a chemistry class, and glass, impulsive tics don't go well together. I ended up just smashing a glass beaker and it went everywhere. And then the whole class just turns around like, what was that massive smash? That was me. Yeah. And there was another time me, my friend and my dad went to the theatre, and like my tics seemed fine at first, but then it got to, there was a part where it was the curious instant of the dog in the night time, but there was a part where they said, he's a mess, and then in the middle of it I just yelled, my dad's a mess. Yeah, and then it got silent, and then I just yelled, boring. So that was interesting. My tics do say very strange things like that at very inappropriate times, especially when it's quiet. It's like my Tourette's wants to be the loudest thing in the room, but I think my Tourette's has done a lot to mortify me. But thankfully I can laugh about it, because I think that, laughing about it can help if certain aspects of it. And like, thankfully I also don't mind other people laughing with me, not at me, but if they're laughing with me at a tic that's genuinely funny and not causing distress, then I think that's fine.
Absolutely. I know certainly at home we managed, many of my son's tics with laughter. They're hilarious, some of them. You can't not laugh, and it would be stranger if we didn't laugh, because they are funny. And I know lots of clients that I have, the parents often ask, how should I react? And I always say, as long as you're laughing with and not at, then that's totally acceptable. Okay, so now I want to move on to talking about tics in specific. Obviously, we're not going to talk about the common motor and vocal ones. I actually want to delve a little bit deeper on some of the ones that aren't mentioned quite so much. If you could mention mental tics and then go on to the difference between a mental tic and an intrusive thought, that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, so mental tics and intrusive thoughts, I think there is a bit of overlap, and sometimes I find it difficult to distinguish myself, but the way I describe it is a mental tic is basically very random. For me, a mental tic was random things in my mind. For example, I would have one where I had a stream of numbers going through my mind in no specific order. I remember I tried to write it down, like, is there a pattern to this? Nope, it's just random numbers. And then it was random words, random phrases, and sometimes I would have it going around in my mind, and eventually it would become a vocal tic as well. So that was interesting. But my mental tics basically just random phrases, random numbers, anything like that. Whereas an intrusive thought was more anxiety-provoking due to the content, and the content was something that caused distress and fear, and it wasn't necessarily random, it was just to do with an obsession, and it was more kind of inappropriate, I'd say, because I had something which I termed opposite thinking. That's something which, an intrusive thought can also be linked to a compulsion if it's like OCD related, but I think you can have intrusive thoughts without the compulsions in some cases. But with I had something called opposite thinking, which was where I would look at something and I would think the opposite of what I wanted to think, which was very, very strange. So I would, for example, look at my friend and think something horrible about them. I'd be like, why did I think that? And sometimes an intrusive thought can cause that sort of distress because it takes you in a voice and you think, did I really think that? Do I mean that? And that can be scary for some people. And then I did also have mental tics where it sounded like somebody else was in my mind saying things, which was very strange. I think that's bordering between an intrusive thought and mental tic as well. I'm not too sure. But with the mental tics, it was mainly just very random, but I think it was a tic of the mind, whereas the intrusive thoughts were more content related. I don't know if I explained that properly, but it's more anxiety provoking if it was an intrusive thought.
Brilliant, thank you. Can we now move on to breathing tics? Not many people, parents are not usually aware of their child having a breathing tic. A lot of children don't actually connect that it's a tic, and it's not until we start asking questions and delving a bit deeper about their tics that it actually comes out. So it'd be really interesting if you could share breathing tics.
Yeah, like in terms of breathing tics, they are a hidden tic, so you wouldn't always tell if somebody's having it, but they can include breathing in patterns, forceful exhaling, they can include holding your breath, or sometimes just feeling as if you can't satisfy the breath. That was a big thing for me. I had a sensation in my chest and I was like, do I have some sort of lung infection or something? So it's just a very strong sensation and it felt like I couldn't satisfy it. That turns out that was a breathing tic. And with the breathing in patterns as well, it can cause issues. It doesn't really look like an issue, but if you are having these breathing tics, it makes it difficult to exercise. It makes it so that your fingers kind of go numb and cold, and then you get really dizzy. So yeah, breathing tics aren't very nice. And with the breath holding as well, I think the breath holding can happen to some people when they're having tic attacks or something as well, and it can be really distressing and scary as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of my older clients who've expressed their kind of version of it have said, it's one of their most problematic tics, because if they hold in their breath, you know, they feel like they're going to faint. If they're out in public and it happens, it's really quite overwhelming and causes a lot of anxiety as well.
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Can we move on to sensory tics? This is always a thrown in question, and which lots of people and are about, so it'd be really interesting to hear your take on this.
Sensory tics, that was something I experienced a lot at the age of 15. It's where you have the premonitory sensation but without a visible tic. So for me, I remember, it's different for everybody, I'm sure, but for me it just felt like there was a sensation going up my finger, up my arm, and down my whole body, and it was very, very strange. And at the time I didn't really know what it was, and I thought, am I like the only one with this? But turns out there's actually quite a lot of people with it. But it's horrible, because I think some people kind of describe it almost like restlessness in a way. But I've heard people say it can sometimes feel a bit like an adrenaline rush as well. So people describe it in different ways. But I think in a way that was kind of more distressing than some of the visible tics, because it's a sensation that you cannot get rid of, and it's overwhelming. And I remember just crying when I was 15, like, how do I stop this? Because there was no way to relieve it. It was just there and going through my whole body, and I could even track it as well. As I was saying, it's very, very strange. And I think that's something, again, a hidden tic. People don't see it, but it does have a massive impact on us.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people like to describe it as the same feeling as a premonitory urge that they get. But with a premonitory urge before a tic, they can tic and the premonitory urge often goes away. But with the sensory sensation, there is no tic to actually get rid of it. So it's, again, really overwhelming and can definitely trigger frustration in many. Okay, brilliant. You have mentioned some co-occurring conditions throughout this. I was wondering if you could kind of give us a rundown of what they are and how they manifest within you.
Yes, for me, there's the pandas, and we do still wonder, like, is my Tourette's like caused or related to the pandas? Because seeing how it came overnight, it could be. So we wonder if the Tourette's and stuff is the result of panda syndrome, which is infection induced. But then I have been diagnosed with OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder. I have both classic and Tourette OCD, but also I am diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. My diagnosis of autism came at the age of 12, and that was an interesting one, because the doctors never knew whether I was autistic or not, because I have a lot of the stimming, I have a lot of the special interest talking about the same thing all the time, but they were confused because I read body language really well. So because I saw an autism specialist at the age of 10, they said I'm not autistic. Then the assessment, they were saying Romy doesn't have autism traits, but then they ended up phoning my dad and saying, we don't know if Romy's autistic, so we're going to diagnose her anyway. So that's how I got that diagnosis.
Wow. How stressful, because, you know, like you say, you've been given this label, but you're not actually sure if you fit, you know, if your shoe fits your foot or not, really. But again, I guess with the pandas question mark, that fits all of those other diagnoses. So that's really interesting. Yeah, fantastic. You've mentioned the OCD and Tourette OCD throughout. Could you explain that a little bit more to the parents? Because I know that's quite confusing to many. So yeah, it'd be really great to hear your side on that.
Yeah, like with Tourette OCD, it can look identical to classic OCD. So to an outside observer, it looks the same, but I think it is important to distinguish it, because classic OCD is where people experience anxiety and intrusive thoughts that precede the compulsions. So it has like a cycle sort of thing. And that's what's most common, I believe, even in the Tourette community as well. But then Tourette OCD is sort of like a small subset. And with Tourette OCD, it's sensation-based. So people will have the rituals and stuff, but rather than anxiety or fear fueled, it will be almost like a tic. so it's kind of voluntary. And for classic OCD, I believe you have CBT and ERP to manage it, but that isn't always effective with Tourette OCD because it's not thought-based, so there's not really anything to work on in that cognitive aspect. And for some people, the ERP can make it worse due to the suppression element. So I think that it is important to distinguish it for the management and treatment. But they are both debilitating, and I would say Tourette OCD is more physically debilitating, although it can be sort of mentally debilitating as well if you don't understand it, because it's confusing to you. And that was definitely my case when I was younger, because it took about 8 hours out of my day. But then the therapy wasn't really helping because the sensations were phantom tics, so it was out of body sensations, and I always called it sticky magic. So I kind of gave it this name, and nobody really understood it, and obviously I didn't understand it myself, so it was very strange. But I would say classic OCD is sort of more mentally and emotionally debilitating as well, because with classic OCD it can cause a lot of fear, anxiety, shame, distress, and all of that sort of stuff.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Well, that brings me to the end of my questions. So now I'm going to open it up to you guys. You can either type something in the chat box, or you can open up your mic. Okay, we've actually got a question just come in. So as a parent, I'm really interested in how best to react to rage and how to help calm the situation. Romy, do you want to give your take on that?
So I think it is just really important to, well, first of all, allow your child to know that they aren't a bad kid. I think that is a really important point, because often we can worry, and sometimes we feel really shameful for it. We think we're bad, but we don't want to be because we can't control it. And I think just sort of understanding that and helping them to understand that themselves, so that it doesn't impact their self-esteem in any negative way. And then also just validating and understanding that they are experiencing distress and that we don't really want to be doing this. And for me, like, I think rage attacks can be experienced in different ways as well. Some people say it's more tic-like, but for me it was more fury for no apparent reason. So I think it's just important to sort of validate the individual's feelings and stuff, so people don't feel judged for something that's out of their control.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a parent perspective, I would say that being really proactive as a parent instead of being reactive is really important. So, if you know some things that calm your child in these situations, or before they cross that line and go into the rage, if you know things that calm them, like if you can see things but potentially brewing, or if there's a pattern that it always happens after school or always happens when you have visitors and stuff, make sure you've got those items or those strategies in place to implement, and try and catch it where possible before the rage actually comes into play. It's difficult, it's not easy. Obviously you have to be quite vigilant and watch your child to get a really good feel, but it's definitely doable. I think if you observe your child for long enough, write some data on it, so ABC data, so antecedent, what happens just before the rage occurs. There might be no pattern, but actually by writing them out you might start to see a pattern emerge. The behavior, so what does the rage actually look like, how does that come out of your child, and then the consequence, what do you do during the rage and after the rage. And it's really good to so you don't want to give them attention when this happens. You want to try and ignore it as long as they're safe, and just try and step back from it, and like I say, really try and be proactive, and praise them if you manage to catch it before it happens. So if you can see something's brewing and you implement a strategy, even if it's going on the iPad, obviously we wouldn't give them the iPad if they're in a rage, because we'd be reinforcing that behavior. But if you can catch them before the rage happens, and kind of divert their frustration levels or whatever it may be, then you can be proactive and you can praise them for you know, calming, and tell them afterwards. Don't maybe tell them just as they're about to tick over into a rage episode, but later on have a chat with them, like, oh, earlier I noticed that you were probably getting quite angry, I gave you something to do, whether it's colouring, iPad, whatever, and you did really, you know, really well calming yourself down, and you didn't get cross today. You know, really praise the good, really focus on the good. I mean, it's really important to remember these rage episodes aren't helped, so I don't want you to think that they are, but just praise wherever you can for the desired behaviour that you like, and they will start to become a little bit more in tune with what their feelings are, before a rage attack happens, and then hopefully you'll be able to start using the strategies themselves, like grabbing some colouring if they can feel that they're getting worked up. Okay, any other questions?
Like with the rage as well, when you say like avoiding the triggers, I think sensory input is a massive thing. Like avoid sensory overload, or even understimulation as well. I find that like understimulation can sometimes have an effect as well. And also some triggers, dietary triggers as well, I think are a factor. For me, it was the food diet, but it will be different for everyone. And like as you say, I think it is really important to know that it isn't a behaviour as such. It's a neurological storm, so it is involuntary. But yeah,
absolutely. Okay, we have another question. Can you establish any calming or breathing techniques to avoid tics starting in the first place? Some people can, some people can't, I think is the answer I would give. It is possible for some people to be able to, if they can feel that a tic attack's coming on, they can sometimes bring themselves back down. Tic attacks are usually fueled by an anxiety drive. So if they can feel that they're starting to get anxious and that could trigger a tic storm, then calming exercises and breathing techniques will definitely help. I'm not going to say that, you know, these calming techniques will stop all tics, but they can definitely prevent tic attacks in some people. Romy, have you got anything to say on that?
I don't really have experience with the breathing exercises, but I have heard somebody else say that it helps them. But obviously, if you have breathing tics, you might not want to do it if it's going to trigger a breathing tic. But if you don't have breathing tics, then it might help, because I have heard it help other people.
Yeah, I mean, with the therapy I deliver, we spend a whole session on learning different calming techniques. So there's things like hand breathing, you've got grounding exercises that you can do. I've got a little animation which I can share with everyone at the end, if you're interested, with a couple of different techniques, but feel free to inbox me and I'm more than happy to discuss that more with you. Andrew, that's fine. Okay, any other questions? If anyone wants to undo their mic and ask vocally, that's absolutely fine. Okay, two more. Do you think it is useful for children with tics to meet other children with tics as support? Okay, Romy, you go first and then I'm going to answer.
Yes, like that. A lot of people do worry about the tic swap. That's where you might pick up tics of others, or sometimes being near other people with tics can exacerbate it. But I do find that the pros outweigh the cons, because I would say that one of the best things for me has been meeting others in the community, and it has changed my life so much. So I think that by meeting others, it helps you know that you're not alone. It helps you find management from other people who are dealing with the same thing. And it helps you make friends as well. I've made some really, really lovely friends in the Tourette's community. So I personally would recommend like meeting other people and stuff. Although I know that you can pick up tics and stuff, which has happened. I've gone back to school after meeting people with loads of new tics, but I think it's worth it. Absolutely.
I run monthly virtual play dates at the minute through lockdown. I also run workshops for learning about Tourette's, which I run in a group environment. So they get to meet others and have a chance to ask questions and stuff in that as well. And I also run local meetups, obviously when we're not in lockdown. I think absolutely right that the pros outweigh the cons. You know, the messages I get after the virtual play dates of how empowered the kids feel from meeting others, and it's great. And I've just seen that Johnny's also put a link in the chat, which you guys have also got a group that you run, so feel free to check that out, everybody.
Yeah, we've just had Dustin join, so thanks for that. I've approved them. If anybody else wants to, thanks.
Okay, and we've got, did you rather your friends know about your diagnosis, and how did you talk to them about it? Our 10-year-old is not sure whether this is good for him or not.
Well, in primary school, as I said, I didn't really open up about it when I was really young because I was ashamed of it, and I didn't know specifically I had Tourette's at that time, but I didn't really open up about what I was facing at home and stuff, all the symptoms. So I think that it does take some time to sort of have that self-acceptance to be able to share with others and stuff. But in secondary school, I think that it has actually been a massive help for me to be able to talk about it, because my friends thankfully are very supportive, and it can kind of be daunting telling people for the first time because you don't know what their reaction is going to be. But I think over time, I think people can begin to understand it and stuff, and I think kids can be pretty accepting once they understand it. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm just going to share something as well, if that's okay. So Harrison wears t-shirts constantly with the fact that he's got Tourette's. His motto is "Tick loud and proud." He isn't going to hide them for anybody, which is really funny considering my job. But yeah, he's absolutely an advocate for ticking wherever and whenever. However, he likes to spread awareness and also give people an explanation. So he does that. And now he's moving up to a new school in September, and he doesn't know anybody at that school. But because of the lockdown at the minute, they haven't been able to have an open day. So instead, they've all been given each other's email addresses. So they've now got a group email chat going on, so they can kind of have a chit chat before they start. And day 2, I think it was, he said, right, I'm telling them all because I just need them to know to get this out of the way because it's playing on my mind. And he literally wrote a paragraph saying, just to let you all know, before you meet me, I have Tourette's. Sometimes I do funny things. Sometimes I say things that I really shouldn't. And you might hear me drop the occasional F-bomb. I hope that's okay. And honestly, I cried with the responses. I've never met these kids. And their response was unbelievable. And now, because he's, shared that, the weight's off his shoulders and he cannot wait to start his new school. But up until he shared that, he was really anxious, really stressing. What do you think people are going to say? What do you think they're going to do? So it's a personal preference, but I definitely think sharing for a lot of people is beneficial.
Oh yeah, definitely. But when you say your son told people at school, I remember I did that. I did an assembly once, and the response was also really, really good. So I think sharing it in that way can be really good.
Absolutely. I have to say, I haven't actually heard of anyone who's been bold and shared it to a group of people and had a negative reaction. It's usually just the odd random person, out in the street, or maybe a kid in school who doesn't know and doesn't understand, that might not be very kind. But actually, by fronting it and putting it out there, often the reaction is really positive. And it definitely helps with reducing anxiety, because once you know that everybody knows, it takes a massive weight off the shoulders of trying to hide it, or trying to blend in, or trying to find an explanation as to why you just did that if somebody asks. So that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Any others? Feel free to put them in the chat. Or of course, under your mic, whichever works for you. Give people a sec to type. Okay, we've got some thank yous, but no other questions. Okay, brilliant. Well, if there's no other questions, then we will finish. If you think of something afterwards, drop me an email, because I know both myself and Romy will be more than happy to answer it. I hope that's correct on your half, Romy, but from knowing you, I am sure that'll be fine. Okay, well, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much for joining us, and hope to see you at our next one, because I'm sure I'm going to rope you into something else, Romy. I love having you on board.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Right, guys, I'll let you all end your end. Romy, if we stay on for a sec.
Well done, and thanks for that, guys.
Oh,
You're
thank you.
welcome.